Okay. Psalm 137, Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. We hung our harps upon the willows in the midst of it. For there those who carried us away captive asked of us a song, and those who plundered us requested myrrh, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. If I do not remember you, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not exalt Jerusalem above my, or let it cling to my mouth, if I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation. O daughter of Babylon, who are to be destroyed, happy the one who repays you as you have served us. Happy the one who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. Oh, that is a rough one. This is a rough psalm because it brings out some of the unsettling ideas of our nature. Now, the psalm is probably written by a Levite. You notice the instruments that they have, the harps that they hung on the willows. Now, this psalm was probably composed after the children of Israel, or the remnant, came back to Jerusalem from Babylon, and they're after the 70 years. Now, the 70 years didn't start in 586, which was the final destruction. It started back in the first deportation when Daniel and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego would have been. There were three different deportations. And so when you have the 70 years of Daniel and Jeremiah, then they were talking about that very first one when the people first started being deported. But this writer, now he's older, and yet if he's been there 50 years, he's probably in his 60s, but it was indelibly marked in his mind what he saw as a child. You can imagine what war would do. Look at what's happening in the Middle East. People never get over that when they see their loved ones slaughtered. And we know that with even Habakkuk, he said, Lord, when are you going to judge Jerusalem? And the Lord said, don't worry, Habakkuk, I'm going to raise up the Babylonians. And then Habakkuk said, wait a minute, Lord, those are mean people. And so, yes, they were noted for their meanness. They were known for their atrocities that they did to people. One of the favorite things that a lot of the ancient lands, and even we saw it in Gaza, they loved to kill the children in front of the parents. And especially the older women, they like to, or the older people, especially the women, they'll take off, and you can imagine what would happen to defenseless people, either in slavery or whatever. And so it was something that, how do you tell a Jew that suffered all that, oh, get over it, like our politicians are doing to the Israelis today? I mean, you just don't do that, especially when they keep getting rockets thrown into their schoolyards and all the rest. And so they want to respond in kind because that's just the Middle Eastern way, it seems like. I've talked to people there, and they will carry a grudge on, if your parent had a grudge on someone else, especially if it's another family or another race, then that will go on for generations. I mean, it's worse than the Hatfields and McCoys. And it's blood libel. I mean, they go after each other. And so this is something that goes back to the time of Abraham and before. And so we see now that he is writing to these people he's writing, and this would be one of the Psalms that they would have sung. And yet it's one of the few Psalms of the 150 that doesn't have a happy ending. They usually say, my hope is in the Lord, or, they'll praise the Lord at the very end. But this Psalm just says, Lord, get them. And so it's kind of one of those unsettling psalms. We call it an imprecatory psalm. That means he's asking the Lord to punish the enemies. And yet it's a psalm where they're dealing with the traumas of their childhood. As Longfellow wrote, the thoughts of youth are long, long thoughts. And so they are. A boy's way is the wind's will, and the thoughts of youth are long, long thoughts. Well, that is interesting because it's so easy as an older person to lapse into things of my youth. I was talking to a nurse yesterday. I went over to a podiatrist, and she was freshly out of college. She was now a resident, and she had a few more weeks. And I said, you guys are getting younger and younger. And started talking. I said, you don't even remember Ben Casey, do you? She said, Ben Casey? You don't remember Ben Casey, do you? Ben Casey was the big fad back when I was a 7th or 8th grader. And we would have these Ben Casey, back then they had these doctor's shirts that was kind of like a tunic that they'd pull over, and it had little button or little snaps up, and Ben Casey always wore it with a couple of the snaps undone. So if you were really cool back as an 8th grader at Lakeview High School in Winter Garden, Florida, you put on that shirt. I didn't have one, we couldn't afford it, but a lot of people did. And they would, you'd walk around with that button, and boy. And Dr. Kildare was on NBC, I think Ben Casey was on ABC, all that kind of stuff. But I remember it, and I still remember many of the programs, and I remember, if I hear the music, boy, right there it is. Well, that's more or less a pleasant idea of childhood, but there's also some things I'd rather forget, and don't we all have them? But can you imagine watching your parents being killed in front of your eyes? Can you imagine watching your brothers and sisters being thrown up against a wall and their heads broken open? I mean, can you imagine seeing this city now that you've been trained as a Levite? Now you're one of those workers in the temple, maybe you're a teenager or whatever, but you're already in the choir and everything, and you watch that temple as it's being burned and the whole city being destroyed. And you can imagine what Jeremiah, remember Jeremiah, Lamentations of Jeremiah, it's all about going through Jerusalem and seeing what the Chaldeans had done, the Babylonians had done. And so you can imagine the trauma, something you wouldn't forget. So when they come back, they still remember it. And Babylon is still over there. Even though they're back, many of them, Babylon hasn't been totally destroyed yet. Remember, the Medes and Persians came in, and they captured Babylon, but they're going to rebel later on, and it's going to be totally destroyed in about 20 years. And so they're still wanting to see what's going to happen to the Babylonians. And so this is really one of those things where, okay, Lord, we're back. But but at the same time, they knew prophecy, because we're going to look and see how many times the prophets, Obadiah and Jeremiah, Isaiah said, something's going to happen to the Babylonians. And so, okay, Lord, you said it, but it's going to happen. And so we look at this, and so we see then, to begin with, that verses 1 through 6, he's talking about remembering. And we say, remember and don't forget. And yet, it's hard to reconcile this psalm with the age of grace in which we live, where the Lord tells us to love our enemies, because this admittedly a difficult situation. I think what he's doing, though, is kind of nationally. What I mean is, when you think of war, you don't think of specifically going in and taking someone out of their house by name and killing them. It's more of, okay, Lord, kill the Germans, or whatever, like in World War II. Lord, deliver me as I go and bomb out all these cities, but you're not wanting to think about what's happening down there or whatever. And that was always a big problem with many of the airmen coming back. They realized after the war, there's a lot of people that were killed by us. And so that's always one of those things. But as far as just, okay, war, we had a big battle. Nobody thinks about all those young men and sometimes women that have been killed, and then all those mothers who are crying, all those homes that are wrecked. 40,000 people in one day, as we saw. Can you imagine what the shock that went through Israel when that happened back that we saw in chapter 5 of Samuel. And so these guys remembered this, and here they're back, but all the trauma of it all. They're back and they're joyful, and yet they look back on the experiences, and it's hard to forgive. And so we see that he's talking about, first of all, we remembered the rivers of Babylon. Now, Babylon as an empire, and the Chaldeans stretched over the Tigris and Euphrates River. And it was the Tigris River, I think, that Babylon actually had built the walls over. And you remember that Cyrus the Mede went under the walls during Belshazzar's feast. But they also had a system of canals that really opened up rich farmland, even out into the desert. And the Babylonians were good builders. Now, if you remember Ezekiel, if you've read Ezekiel, you'll see that many times that Ezekiel would be talking about the waters of Babylon or the rivers of Babylon. And he's talking about, he wasn't in Babylon proper like Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego and Daniel. Daniel and those guys, remember, were part of the king's court. And he took those people, Nebuchadnezzar took those in to want to train them. Now, the rest of them, they were spread throughout the empire, and they had slave labor and all the rest. So they would have been down there like Ezekiel. Ezekiel, we never see him talking to Nebuchadnezzar. And so we see that they were scattered through the empire, but they were given villages. This was the difference between Assyria, where you hear about the so-called 10 lost tribes of Israel, which weren't lost because many of them had already moved down into Judea by the time the Assyrians had attacked. But the Assyrians would just throw people all over the world. And so the northern Israel ceased to exist. But the Babylonians, under the providence of God, would move these people over into enclaves, especially if they were skilled people. And so they would be put in different places, and if they were artisans, singers, or whatever, they had very special places for them. But we see here, though, that it says, the rivers of Babylon, they sat down and wept. And whenever you see sat down and wept in the Bible, that means they were low. They didn't stand, they were weeping. This was the bottom of the barrel for them. When we remembered Zion, we remembered what it was like in our youth. We remembered what it was to play in the streets. Remembered what it was, those great feasts and the singing and just the tremendous things. Now, of course, it's easy to remember that, but the reason that Judea was destroyed, of course, and Jerusalem was destroyed, was because of its sin. But as a young man, you don't remember all that. You just remember the good days. And so they didn't really realize what they had until they lost it. Isn't that true so many times? There was Maxwell Anderson wrote a play on George Washington, and one of the notable sayings that he had George Washington saying is this freedom will seem easy by and by when no one dies to get it. Well, it costs a lot for freedom. Well, we're not going to realize how free we are until we're enslaved. And so we see that these people, they sat down and just cried. But you can imagine, not only for their city, but all the things that they had seen. And even the trip over to Babylon, which was 500 miles or more. And you can imagine the death along the way and just the atrocities that they had on the people. And so they sat down and wept. And notice, we hung our harps. They didn't destroy their harps. They hung them because perhaps they remembered what Jeremiah said, or that, there was going to be 70 years, that they were going to come back. They didn't know exactly how. How do you know the future whenever all you've seen is destruction? Like, how do I know? I know the rapture's coming, and I think it's going to be within the next 10 years. But what's going to happen between now and then? And what if it doesn't? What if it's a little bit later? I know that something's going to happen, and also know that God's got to judge this country if we don't straighten up. We don't realize just how far down we are and how many enemies within our government that we have. And so we all talk about it, but it's not going to happen until it happens. And then all of a sudden, whoa, So this is something where they hung up their harps. But back in the 1600s, there was an Englishman who, I was reading some of his commentary, but he was talking about how that the Jews back then, I'm not sure if they still do this, I haven't had time to see, but when they built their houses in England, they left them unfinished because the temple was destroyed and they weren't going to finish their houses till the temple was rebuilt. I wonder if that's still true. I didn't know that until I read that, and I've been into a couple of Jewish homes whenever they were having a roof put on or whatever, but that'd be something to ask them. But because Jerusalem is not rebuilt and the temple isn't rebuilt, they leave a part of their, now, of course, I'm sure that it's not anything weather. They make sure that everything's closed up. But therefore, a tradition for centuries, they wouldn't finish their house. And so these people didn't destroy their harps. They hung them up and said, we're not going to play them for a while. And the reason we'll see in just a moment. He says, we hung up our harps because our captor said, notice he said, for those who carried us away captives, ask us for a song. They said, hey, listen, we know you guys are playing good songs and you guys like to, you had your dances and all that. So he said, and those who plundered us requested myrrh. So they were saying, hey, listen, sing Amazing Grace for us. Or sing Psalm 23 for us. Or, one of the more peppy ones. We want to hear one of those. And maybe we could dance to them too. And so they were, and so what they're saying is, he said, sing us a song of Zion. And notice in verse 4, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? How can we, when we're mourning, how in the world can we sing to these heathen that all they want to do is make sport of us? And to really ridicule us. So after all, our gods are bigger than your gods. Remember what we saw all during that time. If we beat you, then that means my God's bigger than your God. And we say that, yeah, God's people were defeated repeatedly, but God was never defeated. And so we see that they realized, these people, they were serving the eternal God. And they didn't know exactly what was going to happen. And if they didn't play along with them, they could be persecuted. But they refused to play and their songs to the Babylonians. Now, I'm sure that if a Babylonian started asking questions, and many of them were saved, and if we look at that, even the wise men had been greatly influenced by Daniel. And so there were many that were open, but as far as someone just wanting us to sing because they enjoy the song, we do it for worship, not for entertainment. Unfortunately, we have a whole music industry today that says, hey, we're going to entertain the world, and we're going to win them by entertaining them. Music has never been used in the Bible as an evangelistic tool. It was a preparation for worship. Now, what I mean, I don't mean that God can't use it to move in people's hearts, but the main thing about music is to prepare our heart to hear the Word of God, to get us in the mood or whatever. I was talking to a restaurant man the other day, and he was saying there's certain music that if you play, people will buy more. I said, yeah, that's what Frank Garlock said back in the 60s. I remember some of his old things. And they're just discovering that 60 years later. But music has moods. And that's the reason we try on Sunday morning when everybody's kind of coming in. We always have a peppy song to begin with, or at least a good song that kind of lifts the spirits. It might not have to be fast or whatever, but something peppy to kind of get us awake and moving. Later on, we start getting into the more serious songs. That's the way, that's by design, what I try to do anyway. And then at the benediction, we don't have a peppy song. It's more of a thoughtful. Even if we don't sing it, it's going to be more of a mood song. Music does something. And these men that were singing in the choir, we hung up our harps. We were going to play and desecrate, the name of God by letting these people dance or whatever to something they don't even know what they're talking about. Now, I'm sure when I say dance, but the Jews did have they call them auras, H-O-R-A, or whatever. They did have their different ways, and we even saw it in Fiddler on the Roof. So they did have their different things, but it was never the type of dance that we see today. You didn't even touch a woman, or if you did, it was by her hand or whatever. So it was nothing like we see today in the modern dance. And so, we see that, I mean, they liked a good jig or whatever. And so, hey, but you think about it, a lot of the modern, well, people don't go to church in the last 2 or 3 generations, but back in the 50s and 60s, there were so many entertainers that came out of churches. Elvis Presley sang in I think it was a Pentecostal or a Baptist church in Tupelo, Mississippi. Aretha Franklin was a pastor's daughter. John Denver, his father, I think, was a pastor. You can just name up right on down the list of how many people. Janis Joplin, she was wild. But, these people they grew up in churches. It's amazing, but then they took what they learned. They learned how to sing in churches, and then look what they did with it. And then this singer said, I just can't do that. We're just not going to give our souls. We're not going to cast our pearls before swine. Now, of course, that's what he would consider them. But so he said, we hung up our harps, but we sure hope to play them again. We hung them on the willows, but we didn't destroy them. And but we were going to sing for the captors. But notice he says that if I forget Jerusalem, I mean, that's the one thing. Oh, God's going to let us go back. I don't know how it's going to happen, but God's going to let us go back. Remember Daniel? He kept opening his windows and praying toward Jerusalem. I think that's probably where they get the idea of praying toward Mecca. No, Daniel wasn't praying to the God of Jerusalem. No, he praying to the God of heaven. Remember how many times he said that to one of the kings, even Nebuchadnezzar. There's a God in heaven. So he knew where God was. But they had a very special place because Zion was the city of God. And that tabernacle or that temple was so important to the Jewish thought. And one day, Isaiah tells us, and Jeremiah, I've read Jeremiah, and something's going to happen. We're going to be able to go back, and I'm looking forward to it. And so they would not forget, even in their captivity, even if it cost them persecution, that one day they were going to go back to Jerusalem. And so he said, if I forget that, notice how he does this. He says, how shall we sing songs in a foreign land if I forget you? And notice, forget or remember is mentioned 5 or 6 different times in this song. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my hand forget its skill. So I hope that somebody breaks my hand or, I just forget even how to play if I can't play in Jerusalem again one day, or if I'm not going to honor the people of Jerusalem. But then he said also, if I do not remember you, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. Now, how many times have I come in, and then you've seen me at times when I start singing, if my mouth is dry, it is really hard to sing. But you can imagine what it'd be if I hadn't drank any water for a couple of days. I wouldn't be singing, my tongue would be swollen. That's the idea here. He said, I'd rather thirst to death than to forget Jerusalem. And so this is very important to him. He said, if I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. In other words, the greatest joy and happiness that I could have in life is to go back to Jerusalem. And even Daniel, as an old man, prayed toward Jerusalem. And he was willing to go to the lion's den rather than forget Jerusalem. There was something about that. They knew. They didn't know exactly how. And even when Danielle, my daughter, but Daniel read that passage, and where about the 70 weeks and about Jerusalem, them going back in 70 years. And he said, oh, well, wait a minute, and he started counting, and go, oh, wow, this is it. Now, he wasn't able to go back, but Zerubbabel and others did. So we see that it meant a lot to them to see how that Ezra and Zerubbabel were able to go back to Jerusalem with that first remnant. And so that was just a passion of the Jew. We don't understand that. Today, you talk about Trump all you want to, but the one thing, they've got a city named after him over there in Israel today, because he did something that no person has done in 2,000 years. He recognized Israel, he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. To you and me, okay, so they moved the capital from Tel Aviv. No, to them, that was special. That was, I mean, to a Jew, and especially a godly Jew. Now, you got a lot of secular Jews around here, but to a godly Jew, that was momentous, because, hey, God's coming again. The Messiah's coming. Now, we know he's going to come again, but they're looking for the Messiah. And for Jerusalem now to be considered one of the world's capitals, and knowing one day from what they've read, it's going to be the world capital. Oh my, that does something for the Jewish heart. And so Trump now, former President Trump, is a hero over in Jerusalem, because, how many times since 1948, when they reestablished Israel, did almost every president, promise them that Jerusalem was going to be the capital? And so to us, no big deal. But it's ingrained all the way back into the time as we see here, that it's ingrained into the heart of an Israelite, especially anybody who knows about the Bible, that Jerusalem is a very special place in the heritage of Abraham's people. And so if I forget Jerusalem, I take my talent away, break my hand, do something. If I don't remember you, take my voice away. If I do not exalt Jerusalem above anything else in my life, then take my happiness away. If I don't have Jerusalem, if that's not one of the key things I'm looking for in life, I don't really have any hope. So we see how that we sat down and wept, and now he remembers how that they had that determination. But now they're back in the land, and here with these next 3 verses are troubling to a lot of people, including me at times, because this is one, like we said, it's one of the Psalms where it doesn't end with a praise the Lord. It ends with a prayer for destruction of their enemies. And so notice, first of all, remember, there's that word again, remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation. Now, as we would read in Lamentations 4:21, Jeremiah says, the Edomites helped in fact, they blocked the way of escape for many Jews during the times of Nebuchadnezzar. And then Ezekiel tells us remember, Ezekiel was over in those river things, when he was saying he remembered what the Edomites did in the destruction of Judea. And so he remembered their very special hatred. And Amos, but if you really want a good book, the whole book, of course, there's only 1 chapter, but the whole book of Obadiah is written to the destruction, or to the curse upon Edom. And if you turn over to if you find the minor prophets that comes after Amos, Obadiah, it's only 1 book, but it begins, notice the vision of Obadiah, thus saith the Lord God concerning Edom. And so this must have been written right as before Israel was totally destroyed. And so in the last days, and Israel was always an enemy of Edom, which of course, who is Edom? Means red, which means it was Esau. So these were the cousins, or not cousins, but brothers. And of course, Edom or Esau was always a natural enemy of Israel. And so he says, this is concerning Israel. And the rest of the chapter, which is the book, talks about these things, about what happens. Notice in verse 2, behold, I will make you small among the nations. You shall be greatly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you. You who dwell in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, you who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Now that's one of those interesting archaeological things, because the Edomites, they recessed into the back of the mountains, and they only had a couple of mountain passes where people could get through. And so they considered themselves impregnable. But they also had water that they had to pipe in. And that water, it was a genius way they did it. They actually had running water that went around the city, and you could tap into it, kind of like they tap into city water here. And all the enemy had to do was cut their water off. But they thought that they had it all hidden. And that's exactly what happened to Edom. Somebody cut their water off. And God took care of them. And it was a major slaughter. But we see that, in verse 5, if thieves come to you, if robbers by night, and how will you be cut off? Oh, how you will be cut off. Who will not be stolen till they have had enough? So he's really going on. He's saying, Edom, you're going to have problems. And so if this was written before the fall of Jerusalem, these people knew about the prophet Obadiah. Notice in verse 12, but you should not have gazed on the day of your brother and the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. You should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed at their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. So he's really, the day of their calamity, the day of their calamity. He says, you should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those who among them who escaped. So they were cutting off the retreat of many people that could have left Nebuchadnezzar. Now, was this written before one of the deportations, or was this written somewhere right around that area? We don't know exactly when, but it's obviously saying that Edom, you've already done, and it was true even with David's time. In David's time, you never could trust Edom. They could be your friend at times, but most of the time, they would just as soon destroy you. And that's exactly what he says. If we turn back now to, verse 15, for the day of the Lord upon all nations is near, and you shall have done, it shall be done to you. As you've done to others, it's going to be done to you. And so they've read all that. And so they're praying, okay, Lord, fulfill your prophecy. But the idea there, to its very foundation, is what the enemies of Israel in that area today is still wanting. To the river, to the sea, wipe them out. Wipe them out totally. We would love for Israel to cease to exist. And that's exactly what's happening on the streets of Chicago right now. They don't only want the destruction of Israel, they want its total elimination. Now, that's so sad because there's so many Jews in this country that don't see it, and they will ally themselves with them politically. And that's unfortunately one of the faults of the Jews for the last 2,000 years or more. But I like what Van Gameron, he's one of the commentators that he's done a lot of study of this, but he says, the Edomites were hoping for the destruction of the foundations of Yahweh's rule on earth. When you see the foundations, remember with Job, he would talk about the Lord saying, Job, where were you when I established the foundations of the earth? In other words, the very bedrock, the very crux of creation. So what they were wanting was, Lord, they were wanting to see Israel destroyed completely to its very foundation. And so he said, that's what they want. And by the way, folks, that's exactly what they want today, isn't it? Nothing new under the sun. To the river, when you hear that term, from the river to the sea, that is exactly what they mean. They want to destroy. They would not mind having another Holocaust. They wouldn't mind, and they would even build the ovens to do it. And the more treachery they could do, and you saw some of the pictures of some of those people after that October 7th surprise attack, and some of the hostages that they had, and they're just what they did to them is just unreal, just heartless. putting women up in the back of trucks and riding them off, and those women knew exactly what was going to happen. And just scary. And then the babies that were just beheaded and thrown in front of their parents, and just all kinds of things that the Gazans or the Palestinians had done. And so, again, it would be very difficult to not be angry about that. But unfortunately, we say, well, fight fair, don't kill any of their civilians. Well, as Netanyahu said, we're going to wipe them out totally. And he wants to, but of course he can't. But then again, in all wars, there's always collateral damage. You always have somebody. Wars hurts. And you see in the Civil War in the United States, a lot of innocent people got killed. And there's always the collateral damage. And so, and that's not easy to take. But if you're going to wipe out your enemy, you're going to have to put up with some of that. And so, and that's exactly what we saw in Iraq and places we've been, Germany, Japan. That was a big one for us. Truman had to make a big decision. Are we going to wipe out 2 big cities? If we don't, then our men are going to die. And it was estimated that we're going to lose anywhere from 500 to 1 million people conquering Japan. So what do we do? And then you see all the pictures of Hiroshima and all, the pictures of, and so you look at the individuals and you go, oh, but then if I was president, what would I have done? I think Truman made the right decision as far as we're concerned. There's a lot of men now that have passed on, but their kids or grandkids are alive today. They were born after their fathers came back, or grandfathers, that wouldn't be here today. So we look at it in one way and say, that was the right decision. But then we look at it another way and see that there was a lot of children that got killed in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I mean, but that's war. And that's the sad thing about war. Do I wish it on anybody? No. But when I say, Lord, defeat Iran, I don't want to see a bunch of Iranian children killed. But at the same time, it's going to happen. That's the difficulty of war. That is why any person in charge of military, I would not want to be a general. Okay, we're going to go into war, but we realize we're going to lose 20% casualties. Whose kid's going to be dead? That is difficult. And that's all, but unfortunately, no wonder the Bible says, during the millennium, they'll learn war no more. But war is a savage thing. And as Sherman said, war is hell. And it's about as close to hell as you're going to get here on earth. So I think this psalmist, who's probably, he's a musician. He's not a warrior. But he's saying, Lord, take care of them. You said you would. But I don't think he's thinking about, children dying. But he is praying. But then it does get pretty specific with the Babylonians, because notice how he ends it. He says, O daughter of Babylon, who are destroyed. He knew Isaiah. He knew what Jeremiah talked about. He said, you're going to suffer the atrocities that you put others through. And that's exactly what happened. But he does get it, and this is the unsettling verse. Happy the one who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. Now, he wasn't expecting Israel to do it because they were weak. But he's saying somebody's going to do it to you because you've done it to others. And will we get a satisfaction out? I'll get a satisfaction that Babylon is destroyed, but I'm not looking forward to kids being killed. So again, it's one of those where you pray for the big picture, but you really don't want to look at the specifics. Just like as he, probably now a grandfather, would want to talk to his grandkids about the destruction of Jerusalem, but he wouldn't want to tell them everything. I think it's one of those things that you remember that you'd soon forget. And so, again, this is one of those deep psalms that kind of leaves you unsettled. And yet we see that God puts things in the Bible to make us think. And it's not all pleasant. But I like what, there again, leave it to Spurgeon to really make a concise statement about it. But he says, it is one thing to talk of the bitter feeling which moved captive Israelites in Babylon, and quite another thing to be captives ourselves under a savage and remorseless power which knew not how to show mercy, but delighted in barbarities of the defenseless, or to the defenseless. The song might fitly be sung in the Jews' wailing place, or at the wailing wall. This might be a song that they're singing at the wailing wall today about what's going to happen to the Gazans. So this would be a song that would kind of fit into it. Now there again, I don't think they were thinking specifically of each one of them, but okay, we've seen what's happened to our kids. You know, not that we're willing want it to happen, but it's going to happen if we destroy them. And so it's a hard one, but war's hard. And I'm glad that's not the end psalm. I'm glad it's not Psalm 150. Let's put it that way. But it does tell you that even in them coming back from captivity, there was still a lot of trauma that they had to work through. We hear so much today about PTSD and all that. That's nothing new. It's always been there. And it's sad that trauma is trauma. And it doesn't matter whether it was 586 BC or 1956 AD. If it happened, it happened. And so it doesn't matter whether it was 9/11 or October 7th. People remember where they were and what happened. And it's not easy to say, oh, we're just going to love everybody, unless you're very naive, especially if they're bent on destroying you. Okay, that's a hard one, isn't it? Okay, is there any, boy, we could discuss this for a while, but here on a Wednesday night, you like to go out with a joy, but this is one of those that you have to think about for a while.